Hey guys, this is Mr. Mahmood, and you are watching Defense Lecture 2. In the first unit, we talked about what a pathogen is, and we categorized all microbes as either being helpful or harmful. Now we're going to focus in on those potentially harmful microbes, those disease-causing or pathogenic bacteria, protists, and fungi, and we're also going to think about how viruses can be disease-causing as well. And we're going to think about how our human body has developed its own mechanisms of defense against these particular pathogens. There are basically three lines of the immune system's defense. We're going to spend this lecture discussing the first and second lines of the immune system. And these first two lines of defense are what we consider the non-specific response. So this is the non-specific part of your immune system. We'll talk about what that means as well. And we'll also think about how all of this immune response plays a role in your everyday lives. And hopefully you'll be able to see a lot of connections to things that you can easily relate to in symptoms and things that you've noticed about your own body, maybe not really recognizing how it's the immune system that's responsible for everything that's going on. So let's start by talking about the immune system in general. The immune system, by definition, is responsible for protecting your body against disease. Disease is what, again, we consider anything that causes harm to your body, not including injury. So as long as it's not an injury and we're talking about anything else that can cause harm to your body, it's what we consider a disease. And your immune system will do anything it can to try to protect you from that disease. There are three basic lines of defense that we'll talk about in terms of how you defend your body. One is what we consider that barrier. Everything about the external parts of your body whose sole job it is just to keep things that could be potentially harmful from getting into your body or into the parts of your body that it could really do damage in, which is what we consider our first line of defense. Then we move into our second line of defense, which basically tries to make anything that manages to get through the first line as uncomfortable as it can possibly be. Because if it's uncomfortable, then it's not successfully going through its own replication. And if you can do anything to keep that replication cycle slow, then you're giving your body a fighting chance to really go in and attack whatever's left. And that's where we get into that third line of defense, which we'll talk about in Defense Lecture 3, which are basically like your body's soldiers. Anything that gets through that second line of defense we'll try to make uncomfortable, but ultimately something's got to get in there and really take care of the problem, and that's where our third line of defense comes in. That's the specific response. That's where we figure out exactly what the threat is and then exact methods of attack against it. But these first line of defenses that we're going to talk about here tonight are what we consider non-specific. Your body doesn't really recognize exactly what the threat is. It just protects and attacks everything basically the same way. It's a blanket defense and then a first line of attack against it that's pretty much the same regardless of the threat or regardless of the problem. So these first two lines of defense that we're going to be discussing are what we consider the non-specific immune response. So let's start with the first line of defense. That first line of defense, again, is what you're considering to be your barrier, your body's natural barrier. And if I asked you what your body's natural and most secure barrier is, you should be able to tell me that it's absolutely your skin. Your skin is the largest organ in your body, which you may not necessarily think of your skin as an organ, but if you think of the levels of organization we've talked about before, you go from cell to tissue, which is a bunch of cells. An organ is a bunch of tissues, and your skin is nothing but a bunch of epithelial tissue combined together to serve a very, very common purpose. And for your body, that epithelial tissue is there to basically be your wall to the external environment. If you guys knew how many potentially harmful and hazardous bacteria and viruses and microbes were outside of the surface of your body at any given second, it would amaze you. You guys would become germaphobes in a heartbeat. But the good news is most of the things that you would recognize as being potentially harmful from outside of your body will never make their way in because of your skin, because of that barrier. Your skin, again, is made up of epithelial tissue. In particular, that's what we consider stratified squamous epithelial tissue. We've talked about this briefly before when we were going over different categories of differentiation that occur within cells. Squamous means that they're flat. Stratified means that there are multiple layers. So it's good that your cells in your skin are stratified squamous, because if they were just one single layer, it'd be pretty easy for things to make their way in and out. But because you have so many stacked cells on top of each other in kind of an irregular pattern, there's no sort of straight solid lines or anything like that, then it's very difficult for anything to seep its way through. So very few chemicals that are found here on Earth are actually able to pass their way through the whole surface of your skin, which is good for your immune system, because that means most of the things that come in contact from the outside of non-damaged skin will never be able to pass their way through. So that's the good news. So as long as your skin is not harmed, then it is an excellent barrier for the majority of anything that could pass through your body. So there are a couple of things to think about there. Obviously, if there's an injury, or if there's any part where the skin is now broken, now you're exposed and you're vulnerable to any kind of a bacterial infection. And what's really interesting, and we've talked about this before, a lot of those top layers of that stratified squamous tissue are actually dead already. Your skin cells regenerate pretty quickly. So a lot of the cells that are really at the top surface are dead skin cells. That's why you don't have a whole lot of reaction and sensitivity at the top surface of your skin. And that's why you have a lot of flaky skin, dry, ashy skin and stuff like that tends to fall off, because it's all dead cells. And that's why a lot of the bacteria and things that are there won't really do anything to harm you, because they have nothing to feed on, because those cells are dead anyway. So it's only if you can get underneath those first few layers of cells that you really start having a problem. You remember back when we talked about catalysts, and we were referring specifically to hydrogen peroxide, and how when hydrogen peroxide comes in contact with the outside surface of your body, it really does nothing, because there are no living cells there. But once you expose it to actual living tissue and living cells that have all of that catalase and that enzyme that we've talked about, the same enzyme that's found in the liver that you guys used in those chemical reactions, then you see all kinds of reactions coming out from it, because it lowers the activation energy. So the same thing's true. Your skin, your unbroken skin, is highly, highly protective because of its natural multi-layered structure and how the top layers are dead anyway. So a lot of the microbes that would get onto that surface really don't do anything to harm you either way. So there's this huge push for antibacterial soaps and things like that. Sure, there's a benefit for that, especially if you're about to eat and things like that, because you definitely don't want to encourage bacteria into your body other ways, which we'll talk about. But ultimately, most of the stuff that's on the surface of your body isn't going to cause you any kind of a harm because of this natural stratified squamous barrier. Coincidentally, your skin does a great job covering most of your body, but there are parts of your body that are not naturally protected by your skin. And those would be the openings, the parts of your body where there isn't skin completely covering it. So there are other components within our body besides just the skin that's considered our first line of defense. So our first line of defense is basically any and all natural barriers that naturally protect pathogens that are outside of your body from easily being able to work their way in. So we'll talk about all these different varieties based on this diagram that you see here. So we've already covered the skin surface. That's what we consider the physical barrier of your body, as long as it's unbroken. And again, any kind of an injury or a severe situation where multiple of those cells are actually destroyed or pulled away, like with a serious burn, if you have a major burn or anything like that, those people have a high susceptibility to gaining infection. So infections are a big threat for someone with massive burns or a serious injury. That's one of the major threats, just as much as anything else that could occur in terms of protecting other organs or parts of the body. Once you've exposed that natural barrier, certain pathogens, particularly types of bacteria, could easily start developing serious infections because that first barrier has now been breached. So we do everything we can to protect that from happening. Your skin does a great job of that, and the flora that you see here is basically referring to the population of bacteria that's naturally found on the surface of your skin. Now, besides your skin, we talk about all the different areas of your body that have natural openings where the skin itself is not protecting it. So let's focus in on the face. In the face alone, you have multiple exposed areas. You have your mouth, your nostrils, your eyes, and even your ears are all exposed. They don't have a full covering of skin protecting you. There are openings, and each one of those openings has its own natural defense as considered part of your first line in your immune system. Let's start with your eyes. You guys tear up for one of two reasons. One of them has to do with your immune system. The other one has to do with a weird little emotional response to your brain. The emotional response to the brain you guys will probably learn about as you move on into some more advanced biology. We're going to focus in on your immune response when we talk about tears. The only time that you would ever tear up besides being very happy or sad or because of an emotional response is because you get something in your eye. or you feel like that there's something in your eye. If you ever notice dust particles or anything like that getting into your eye, or if you ever feel like something gets into your eye, one of the first things you do, besides just naturally closing your eyes as quickly as possible, is you start tearing up. So those tears actually contain enzymes called lysozymes that help destroy and break down any kind of a potential pathogen that could be on the surface, because things can diffuse through those cells of your eyes. Your eyes are living tissues, so things can pass through those. So you have natural protective lysozymes in your tears and in your tear ducts. So when you do produce those tears, it's a natural protection. Now let's talk about your nose and your mouth. Both are ways that you can take a breath in, right? You breathe in all the time, and you breathe in either through your nose or through your mouth. One of those is much safer for you if you think about your first line of defense. So let's talk about your mouth. Let's talk about breathing in through your mouth. First of all, before we ever get inside of your mouth, have you guys noticed how the skin cells that are on the surface here of your lips are different than the rest of your skin? There's a reason for that. The surface of your skin is made of the stratified squamous epithelium that surrounds your whole external parts of your body that make up your skin. But your lips are actually the same tissue that makes up the inner linings of your esophagus. If you think about it, the way your lips developed were actually just sort of an extension of your esophageal cells, just kind of wrapped around. So next time you kiss your boyfriend or your girlfriend, I know we're getting close to Valentine's Day and things like that, think about the fact that you're actually kissing their esophagus, because that's pretty much what you're doing. It's the same internal lining of your mouth that's wrapped around to represent your lips. So it is what it is. It is coincidentally also stratified squamous epithelium, but it's absolutely different in terms of its structure than what you see on the external parts of your body. But that is there. Again, stratified squamous is good. You can't naturally get a whole lot of things coming in and out of your lips to protect you, so that's good because you have multiple layers there. But now let's talk about getting in to your mouth. If there is a pathogen, let's say you take a deep breath in and a huge amount of pathogens pass their way into your oral cavity, you do have some natural protection. You have enzymes there that can help destroy and kill a lot of those microbes that are coming into your oral cavity, but really those enzymes are there to help you digest food, which means they don't naturally line every component of your oral cavity in your mouth and down into your throat, into your trachea, which is kind of bad news for you because a lot of the air that you're breathing, if you breathe straight in through your mouth, goes straight past any possible saliva there, which can be a pretty serious threat to you. Now compare that to breathing in through your nose. If you breathe in through your nose, you should know you've got quite a bit going on there that's going to make it much harder for any kind of microbes to pass through. Because you have a much more narrow cavity, so there's less space for microbes to pass through without hitting some sort of a wall. But most important, you have what's called cilia. Cilia are these little tiny microscopic hairs that go all the way through your nasal cavity down into your trachea, down into your throat. Those little tiny hairs will do a great job of catching and capturing a lot of the potentially harmful pathogens that you're breathing in through your nose. Now I'm not talking about nose hairs. You all have nose hairs as well. I'm talking about cilia. These are microscopic and they're all lining out that cavity all the way in. Your oral cavity doesn't have that. So it's not until it meets the nasal cavity here in that middle section, as you move down into your larynx, down into your trachea, that the cilia there is represented. So a lot of the air that you're breathing through your mouth isn't really that well protected. And even beyond the cilia in your hair, you also have what's called the mucus that's developed in your hair. Mucus is what you consider as the stuff that develops when you have a runny or a stuffy nose. There are all kinds of common names for it. But that mucus, again, has a high amount of enzymes there to help break down and kill off a lot of the potentially harmful pathogens that come in your way. And it also does a great job to catch and capture a lot of those pathogens as well. So nose breathers, for multiple reasons, have a much more protective pathway of the air that they're breathing in. All of the cilia and mucus will do a great job of protecting it, whereas your oral cavity, you just have a little bit of saliva in the mouth. It's not nearly as thick as mucus, and it doesn't block everything that's coming in. So a lot of the air you breathe goes straight through, and then you just have a little bit of that cilia that gets caught right there at the larynx as you move down into your trachea. And that's about it in terms of protection for mouth breathers. So you have all of these different cavities throughout the top part of your body that aren't naturally protected by skin, but because of all the other components of your first line of defense, there's quite a bit that blocks a lot of the pathogens that could potentially make their way into your body and cause some serious threats. So all of that's taken care of sort of on the oral side of your body. Now you do have other parts of your body that have natural protections as well. Particularly, let's talk about food. When you do bring food into your body, there is absolutely the potential that some of those things you're bringing in could cause some serious harm to you. We've talked about food poisoning before. There are all kinds of potential diseases out there because of it. Now, your oral cavity has those enzymes. Again, those enzymes also, when you're swallowing your food, do a good job of killing off a lot of the initial pathogens that could be there. But even as you swallow your food and you go down into your esophagus, down into your stomach has a great deal of enzymes and a particularly strong acidic environment that does a very good job of killing off a lot of pathogens as well. It's a naturally highly acidic environment. The pH is 2, which is a low pH, which again means it's a strong acid, and that does a good job of killing off a lot of what you're eating as well. So all of this is considered part of your first line of defense. Even before we talk about your immune system really responding at all, it's just a barrier at this point. All the different ways your body blocks things from getting in. Now if something does happen to get through this first line of defense, now the immune system is going to have to work a little bit harder to try to keep your body safe. And this is where we get into the second line of the immune response, which is considered the inflammatory response. The inflammatory response is solely responsible for making your body as uncomfortable as possible for the pathogen that's just invaded. Your body is going to do what it can to keep something that did manage to get through the first line of defense from being comfortable. Because if that pathogen is comfortable in your body, it's going to grow like crazy, which is bad for you. Because if a small population could pose some sort of a threat, if that population gets bigger and bigger, then it could become very serious for you. So we do what we can to make it as uncomfortable as possible for your body. And here's where it's going to get interesting for you. Think about any symptom that you've ever had of any kind of a disease or sickness. The symptoms are things that make you feel bad. That's what you feel when you're sick. A runny nose, a stuffy nose, a fever, headache, stomach ache. All of the bad feelings that you have that associate with disease and with being sick. Every one of those symptoms are actually caused by your own immune system. Your own immune system is causing every symptom that you feel. It's not the disease. The disease isn't causing you the feeling and the fatigue and the sickness. It's all caused by your immune response. And most of it is right here by your inflammatory response. Because it's the job of the inflammatory response to make the pathogen uncomfortable. And if the pathogen's uncomfortable, you're uncomfortable. So the idea of fever, headaches, sore throat, all of the increased swelling and redness and irritation, all of those things that happen when you're sick and when your body's trying to fight off infection, all of those are naturally produced by your own immune system to protect you. Things like fever. Fever is one of those go-to responses by the inflammatory response to try to make your pathogen uncomfortable. Most pathogens that are trying to get into our bodies and that would typically be very successful in our bodies have adapted to become very successful in our body temperature, which is right at about 37 degrees Celsius or about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. They're the ones that are naturally successful in that environment, so they're the ones that have continued to get passed on from one person to the next. So they do very well at 37 degrees, which is not good for us. So if we do recognize that something is passed through our first line of defense, our inflammatory response will start doing things like increasing your overall body temperature. It's doing this because it's trying to help control the pathogenic population. So a fever is actually a good thing. Your body is doing it for a reason. You're wanting to get a fever because you want your immune system to be able to have a fighting chance against this particular pathogen. So if you can make it harder for the pathogen to replicate, that's a good thing. So when you develop a slight fever, it's because your body is trying to control a pathogen. A lot of us see a fever as a bad thing. Oh, I have a little bit of a fever, I have a little bit of a sore throat, I have a little bit of a cough. All of these symptoms that you start noticing that your body has are ways that your body is just trying to block and keep things from ever getting back in. Let's go back to the first line of defense. Let's say you have a cold. If you have a basic cold, notice some of the symptoms that come with a cold. A fever, It's increasing temperature so that the viruses aren't as successful getting into those host cells like we talked about before. Let's say you have a runny nose or a stuffy nose. Both of those are your mucous membranes doing whatever they can to try to block any more of the virus from getting in. So a runny nose are trying to flush out as much of the pathogen as possible and keep anything else from coming in. Or a stuffy nose, the exact same concept. They're just trying to naturally block that nasal passage so that no more pathogens can get in. The redness and the swelling and your tear ducts releasing your tears to make you have watery eyes, all of those are just ways to keep the cold from getting anywhere further and to make it as uncomfortable as possible while it's in your body. So these are always your first line of defense. Your natural barriers try to block even more. And your second line of defense with the inflammatory response tries to do whatever it can to make that cold uncomfortable and not able to replicate the way it needs to. So the basic symptoms that come with the inflammatory response are fever, swelling, and redness. All of those are caused for a reason. The fever increases the temperature of the body, makes it uncomfortable. The swelling and redness both have to do with what your cells are doing to try to fight off this infection. So the cells that are involved in your inflammatory response are typically known as macrophages. Macrophages are cells that have a basic goal. Their job is to go around, find any sort of pathogen that causes any kind of a threat, bring it in, and just kill it off. And usually the way that it finds a cell that's a threat is by looking at its marker proteins, like we've talked about before. If it sees a marker protein it's not used to, it's a threat, it brings it in the body, and it breaks it apart. So macrophages are responsible for just flowing through your bloodstream, looking for things out of the ordinary, surrounding it, bringing it in, and destroying it. So when your immune system recognizes a threat, it's recognized because these macrophages see the marker protein that's not used to seeing. And these macrophages naturally flow through your bloodstream. Think back to what we talked about with other structures in terms of structure and function and how differentiation happens. Remember we mentioned your bone cells are responsible for making all of your blood cells. That's not just red blood cells. Your red blood cells are made in the middle or shaft part of your bones, but on the ends of your bones are what we consider the yellow bone marrow. That's where all of your white blood cells are made. And a lot of these white blood cells are these kinds of macrophages. These are types of macrophages particularly called granulocytes, neutrophils, basophils, eosinophils. You don't have to know all the details of them, but all of these cells are responsible for basically patrolling your body, looking for any marker proteins it's not used to seeing. So these white blood cells are naturally produced in your bone marrow and then passed into your bloodstream through all of those Haversian canals that have the blood vessels, like all the stuff we've talked about before. So these macrophages are sort of like your body's security guards. They're on patrol all the time looking for any kind of a threat. And if it finds a threat, then it initiates all of that inflammatory response that we were talking about. It makes it uncomfortable while they go and try to kill off whatever they can. And pretty much they kill everything the same way. If it's something that's not supposed to be there, they bring it in, they break it apart. So these guys flow through your bloodstream. If it does recognize a threat, it identifies a marker protein of a bacteria, for example. Let's say there's some sort of a bacteria that got in through your skin. Then it will go in and try to attack that bacteria. So it'll pass its way through your blood vessels, through these little tiny openings that are in your blood vessels, and those macrophages will make their way to the infection, surround the infectious bacteria, and start breaking it apart. And more of these macrophages will go into the site of the infection and continue to do the same thing. Now, once a few of these macrophages recognize the threat, it'll instigate a chemical response that does a couple of different things. That chemical response is basically responsible for getting as many of the white blood cells to the site of the infection as possible. And it'll release these chemical signals that will cause a little bit of the plasma or the fluid that's in the blood vessels to seep out into the tissue to cause that swelling, which again makes it uncomfortable for the cells to function, the bacteria or the pathogen. And it causes your blood vessels to open up or vasodilate, which is good for two reasons. Because with increased blood flow, you get more blood into the area, and the pores that are there that naturally allow your white blood cells to come out open up as well. So that opening up of your blood vessels causes the redness because you get blood closer to the surface of your skin, so that gives you the redness symptoms that you see. And the swelling and the inflammation all comes from the release of plasma into the area so that more of these cells can fight off the infection. They go to where that plasma is, and then they continue to just surround and destroy pathogens as much as they possibly can. And a lot of times what ends up happening as these white blood cells go to the site of the infection is they pretty much go on what's considered like a kamikaze mission. It's a suicide mission. Their job is to go kill pathogens, and typically in the process they use up all of their own resources and they die as well. So imagine having this infection, let's say on the surface of your body. Let's say you have bacteria that's able to pass through certain pores, and maybe you have a lot of release of oils that catch and capture some of that bacteria, so you just have bacteria sitting deep inside of your pores. Your immune system recognizes the threat. The pathogens are going to begin to be attacked by these macrophages. The blood vessels around those areas will start to dilate, so you get redness and swelling, and you have all these macrophages going to the site of the infection, killing off bacteria, and they die in the process as well. What do you think that would develop into if all of that was happening, say, on the surface of your face? All of that causes a pimple. And this is a good example of a way they can relate to your everyday lives. I know pimples and acne is not an issue that we're all very comfortable talking about, but we all develop them. It happens to everybody. It happens to the best of us. We get pimples. At your age, it's typically more common because your hormonal changes usually cause a little bit of excess oil production in your pores. So with extra oil production in your pores means a better chance of bacteria that does happen to get through the pores of getting caught and captured in that oil. So you have bacterial infections that are hard for your body to get out because of all of that excess oil blocking and trapping it. So because of the bacterial populations developing, your immune response recognizing the threat, they go and try to kill off the bacteria, and in the process they cause all of the inflammation, redness, and swelling that you see. And you might notice if you ever do have a pretty serious pimple, the area around the pimple or area on the pimple is actually a little bit warmer than the rest of the body. It's because, again, they're trying to make that area uncomfortable. This is all your inflammatory response trying to fight off your infection to protect you because they found the threat by recognizing the marker protein. So you see how this all works. So imagine the pimple is just an area of an infection that's being fought off by your inflammatory response. You have white blood cells going to the area, these macrophages going in, killing off as much as they can, one after the other going to the area and dying in the process. So as you get more and more of these white blood cells dying in the area, it causes more and more inflammation, more redness, so the pimple gets bigger and bigger, maybe a little more red, and eventually you get to the point where there's so many white blood cells that have gone to the site of the infection that have died off, you just get this collection of white blood cells all developing right there that are right at the surface of the infection. And that's where you get into the idea of like a whitehead. You see that little white center? That's white blood cells. Those are your cells at work fighting off the infection. Now what do you think the worst thing you could possibly do at that point is? When that big pimple has that white head right at the top and your white blood cells are working at their high optimum levels, your inflammatory response is working very, very strong to fight off and control as much of the infection as possible. What do you think the worst thing you could do is? Pop that pimple. If you pop that pimple, think about what you're doing. You are destroying your body's first line of defense in that area. Instead of trying to fight off an infection that's just developing underneath or right within the pore, now you've caused this huge injury where now that skin is completely exposed to all of the pathogenic bacteria that's out on the surface. So not only now are you trying to fight off an infection that was developing within a pore, now you have this huge open injury to deal with where it's very likely that your body's going to have to go through more of an inflammatory response to fight off the reaction, which is why you have a lot more redness and a lot more irritation because you popped the pimple. The best thing you can do is leave it alone, because as long as that external skin remains unbroken, then your immune system will slowly pull all of those white blood cells that have been dying in the fight back into your bloodstream and be filtered out by other organs in your body, like your liver and the other parts of your body that will filter out all of those dead white blood cells. So eventually those pimples do go away if you leave them alone. But the more injury and irritation you cause, the more your inflammatory response has to work. So you see how all this works together. Every idea, every symptom that you feel in terms of redness, swelling, irritation, all of that is your own immune system trying to protect your body from that threat becoming any worse. And ultimately, we all within the human population have a pretty consistently successful inflammatory response. All of our cells do a good job of protecting against those pathogens that really are potential threats for us. Things that could be very pathogenic, bacteria, potentially harmful viruses and things like that. Your inflammatory response usually does a very good job of fighting those things off for the most part. Some will be able to pass through, and those you eventually have to work into your specific immune response, and that's what the whole third lecture is about. But most of them do get blocked here by, if not the first line, then here with the inflammatory response, things can usually get under control. So from one person to the next, this is pretty consistent. However, there are some of us whose inflammatory response is more sensitive than others. And here's where it gets into some more interesting application that you can see to your everyday life. If you naturally see a pathogen, something that's disease-causing, your inflammatory response will attack against it. Your macrophages will recognize the marker proteins, and they'll go and try to attack it and try to keep your body from developing any sort of a more serious infection. However, what if your immune system recognizes things as threats that really aren't a threat? What if your immune system saw certain types of things passing through your first line of defense that pose absolutely no threat to you, but you still see it as a threat and you still fight it off the same way with the same inflammatory response? That's what you consider an allergy. An allergy is an inflammatory response towards something that's actually non-pathogenic. So if your body naturally fights off a pollen grain the same way that it fights a cold virus, then you have an allergy to pollen, because your inflammatory response is going to be triggered by pollen when someone else's inflammatory response would not be. And it shouldn't be, because again, pollen serves no real threat to you unless you have such a strong allergy that all of the symptoms you're going to be developing actually can turn around and be more life-threatening to you. Then that's a serious problem. So an allergy is when your immune system attacks something that doesn't really pose any kind of threat. We could talk about things like pollen grains. There are all different kinds of food allergy. There's pet dander. You could have allergies to all kinds of plant life like ragweed and things like that. Your body's allergies are just the way that it attacks things that have no threat to you. Allergies really are just a representation of a really strong immune system. Most people who have really strong allergies rarely get sick. My wife is a perfect example. My wife very rarely gets sick. I've been with her for quite a while now, and I can count the number of times she's been sick and had to take days off from work with just one hand. It's very, very rare for her. But she also has really severe allergies. She's constantly sneezing, has stuffy noses, has a hard time breathing, and multiple symptoms that come around because her immune system is so strong that it not only protects against a lot of the things that could cause serious disease, but it also finds threats where there really aren't any. So she has a lot of these little allergies along the way. Allergies are caused by a particular category of these macrophages and these white blood cells called mast cells. A mast cell is the cell that's responsible for allergies. When they recognize something that they see as a threat, when they recognize particular marker proteins that they see as a threat, those mast cells release what's called histamine. Histamine is a chemical signal that encourages a mass production and mass influx of the remaining macrophages and the remaining parts of your inflammatory response. So wherever you see a lot of histamine production in your body, you're going to see a lot of the symptoms of redness, swelling, and irritation. So people who have high allergies for something have mast cells that are very sensitive and that release a lot of histamine whenever they come in contact with certain allergens. An allergen is something that triggers an allergy. So whatever that may be. If you're allergic to peanuts, anytime you come in contact with peanuts, your mast cells produce massive amounts of histamine, which introduce a whole lot of the immune response, a lot of inflammation, and problems that come with that. So typically, people who have allergies try to control their response as much as possible. Now, I said this before, a lot of the response of your immune system is there to protect you. So if you do actually have a fever, if you do have a headache, if you do have redness and swelling and things like that, as long as it's in moderation, it's actually there to help you. So if you were to go home and take medication that would reduce your fever, reduce your redness, reduce your swelling, reduce your symptoms, you're actually hurting your immune system, because you're keeping your immune system from doing its job and allowing the pathogen to have a better chance at success. Normally that's the case. Of course, there is the extreme. If your fever is way too high, you're talking about like a 102 or higher fever, you have very severe symptoms that your body's producing to try to fight an infection, then yeah, you do want to take medications to help you. You absolutely want to go see a doctor and let the doctor prescribe you the right medications. But if we're talking about just a moderate sickness and your body's doing what it can to fight a disease, those symptoms are there to help you. Now, allergies are the exception. There is no benefit of your body going through an inflammatory response for pollen. There's no benefit of going through an inflammatory response because of pet dander. So people who have allergies are highly encouraged to take medications to help calm down that inflammatory response, because it's not there to help you. It's not actually doing anything to help you, and in fact it could actually cause a threat to you. So because you were talking about the release of histamine here because of these mast cells, most medications in relation to allergies to try to suppress and control your allergies are medications that are called antihistamines. And antihistamine is exactly what it sounds like. It slows down, or it's against the production of histamine. So if you have mast cells that are naturally sensitive to certain allergens and naturally release histamine when they're ever in presence of them, an antihistamine will just slow down your mast cells. So if your mast cells don't produce as much histamine, then you don't get as much of an inflammatory response and you feel better. So if you have allergies, you naturally take different categories of antihistamines like Benadryl or loratadine, and different examples of things that you find in like Claritin and Zyrtec and things like that. They're all antihistamines. They all work to slow down your mast cells so that you don't have as much of a natural inflammatory reaction to things that really pose no threat at all. And for the really severe situation of allergies, if you're someone with a really severe allergy to something, or if you know somebody that is, you'll notice that they might carry around something called an EpiPen. An EpiPen is a pen that actually has a significant dosage of a very strong hormone called epinephrine. Epinephrine's role is the same thing that we consider as adrenaline. We've talked about this before. It's your body's natural fight or flight response, and it's how you get a whole bunch of oxygen into your blood so that you can either fight to defend yourself or run as fast as you can to get away from some sort of a threat. Epinephrine does a very specific thing within your body. Particularly has to do with your blood vessels. The role of epinephrine is actually to get your blood vessels to constrict very quickly. And it closes off all of those pores that we were talking about before of how blood cells can get out. So by doing that, it causes your blood vessels to very quickly transport the blood straight to the heart without going anywhere else. And so that blood that gets to the heart can pump back up to the lungs quickly and get all of its oxygen. So it's basically a way for your body to get oxygen quickly because it constricts blood vessels, keeps them blocked from getting out, so everything goes straight to the lungs and the heart. Now, some smart doctors a while back realized that if we understand what we talked about before about how your inflammatory response works and your macrophages, you guys remember this diagram here? Your macrophages flow through your bloodstream. And when they recognize a threat, the blood vessels open up and those pores open up so that all of those macrophages can get out and go fight the infection. And as you can imagine, if you have histamine, a lot of histamine release in that tissue, the blood vessels really open up and a lot of those cells will get out in the area and really fight it off. So you have a high production of redness and swelling and all the irritation that comes with it. So if somebody has a severe allergic reaction, and we're talking about the kind of severe reaction that could close up your breathing passageways and so you can't breathe anymore, or cause highly severe allergic reactions, then that's a life-threatening situation, and you need to do something to quickly calm down that immune response. And so an epinephrine, if it constricts your blood vessels and it closes off your pores, it actually does a really good job. When you have a severe allergic attack where your blood vessels really open, it quickly closes them up. So that EpiPen usually does a good job and could potentially save your life from a severe allergic reaction because it closes off the ability of your white blood cells and all of that histamine release to make it to the site where the allergic reaction is occurring. So it's a good way to quickly shut down your release of the mast cells and the histamine and the rest of the macrophages to the infection to help calm down that allergic reaction until you can get to an area where you can get away from the pathogen and you can start taking other kinds of medications to slowly get your body functioning back to normal. So all of this, again, is just because your body is naturally trying to protect itself from something that it sees as a threat. But unfortunately, with an allergy, it really has no threat. The threat comes from what your immune system is doing to try to fight something that really is perfectly normal. That's why you can have a severe reaction to some particular allergen, and the person next to you has absolutely no idea that it's there because their mast cells are not nearly as sensitive to that allergen as yours are. So you see how all of this works together. This is your first and second lines of defense, what we consider the non-specific immune response. Your immune cells will attack any sort of threat the same way, whether it's HIV or a pollen grain. And it's called the inflammatory response if it can get past that first line or the barrier. So when we get into the next lecture, we're going to talk about what's considered the specific immune response. We've gotten past the first two lines of defense, and now there's a pathogen that could pose a potential threat to your life. And so if we continue this non-specific attack of fighting everything off the same way, we're not going to be super successful. Now the goal is going to be to figure out exactly what it is, figure out exactly how to fight against it so that that particular infection could be controlled and possibly protect you for the rest of your life from ever seeing that same thing again. That's the third line of defense. That's going to be the next video. So I hope you guys got a lot from this, and I'll see you next time.